You are not falling asleep. That's the first lie the night tells you. Because even now, while your body is already heavy, while your breathing is slowing down without asking for permission, something inside you is still listening, still watching, still awake in a quiet, uncomfortable way. There is a part of your brain that does not care that the lights are off. It does not care that the day is over. It does not care that you are tired. It waits. And the moment no one is asking anything from you anymore, the moment there is no screen glowing, no voice calling your name, no task left unfinished in front of you, that is when it begins. Tonight is not about falling asleep. Tonight is about what happens just before you do. If you have ever wondered why the last thoughts of the day are never the most important ones, why your mind suddenly drags up a memory you haven't touched in years, why silence feels louder at night than noise ever did during the day, then stay. Because for the next 3 hours, we are not trying to explain the brain. We are not trying to teach it. We are not trying to control it. We are simply listening to the brain when no one is left to wake it. Before we go any further, if you want more recordings like this, slow, deep, and designed to be experienced rather than understood, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who struggles with quiet nights, and subscribe to Sleepy Scientist Recordings. These recordings survive only if they are kept. Thank you for keeping this one alive. Now, let the room stay exactly as it is. No need to adjust your posture. No need to force your eyes closed. No need to try to relax. Your brain doesn't respond to effort at this hour. It responds to absence. Absence of demand. Absence of urgency. Absence of being needed. During the day, your brain is a worker. It solves, it predicts, it reacts, it filters thousands of signals just to keep you moving forward. But at night, when the schedule dissolves and the future stops knocking, the brain becomes something else entirely. It becomes a storyteller with no audience, a librarian reshelving memories in the dark, a machine running without instructions, choosing its own rhythm. And that shift does not happen instantly. There is a threshold, a narrow, fragile moment where you are no longer fully awake, but not yet asleep. Most people miss it. They scroll past it. They distract it. They override it with noise or exhaustion. But if you slow down enough, if you stay here, you can feel it happening. It starts with time behaving strangely. Minutes stretch, seconds soften, thoughts lose their sharp edges. You may notice your breathing first, not changing, just revealing itself. Inhale, exhale. The brain registers this not as a command, but as a signal. Nothing needs to be done. And when nothing needs to be done, the brain begins to speak in a different language, not words, fragments, images without context, sensations without names, memories without timestamps, a hallway, a face you can't quite place, a feeling that arrives before you know what it belongs to. This is not randomness. This is the brain switching modes. During the day, it is a gatekeeper. At night, it becomes a wanderer. And wandering is dangerous, not in a loud way, but in a quiet, intimate one. Because when the brain is no longer protecting you from unnecessary thoughts, it allows the unfinished ones to surface. Not the big regrets, not the obvious worries, the small ones, the conversation that ended too early, the moment you didn't react the way you wanted to, the version of yourself that existed briefly and then disappeared. These thoughts don't come with emotion at first. They arrive neutrally, as if the brain is simply asking, Do you still want this? Is this still relevant? Can I put this away now? Most nights, you answer without realizing it, by drifting, by letting the thought pass, by not grabbing onto it. But some nights, you listen, and listening changes everything. Because the brain, when it realizes it is being heard, slows down. It stops throwing everything at you. It starts selecting. This is why insomnia feels different from night to night. Some nights are noisy because the brain is still being watched. Other nights are quiet because it finally feels alone, alone enough to be honest. Honest about what it kept, honest about what it discarded, honest about what it never resolved. And here's the strange part. The brain does not do this for reflection. It does it for balance. Sleep is not rest. Sleep is maintenance. And maintenance begins before unconsciousness. Right now, whether you realize it or not, your brain is deciding what deserves to move forward with you into tomorrow and what needs to stay behind. This is why the last thoughts before sleep feel so personal, so unedited, so close. They are not meant for explanation. They are meant for sorting. You might feel a subtle heaviness behind your eyes, not sleep yet, just the suggestion of it. You might notice your thoughts becoming less linear, less interested in conclusions. That is not losing control. That is control being returned to the system that knows how to let go. And as you stay here, as you continue listening without interfering, something important happens. The brain realizes it no longer has to perform. No one is evaluating it. No one is asking it to be productive. No one is expecting clarity, so it stops explaining itself. It starts feeling instead. And feelings are slower. They stretch. They loop. They don't need endings, which is why this recording has none. Because tonight is not about arriving anywhere. It is about crossing a boundary so subtle that most people never notice it. The boundary between thinking and remembering, between remembering and drifting, between drifting and letting the brain do what it has always done best when left alone. In the next part, we won't talk about sleep. We will talk about that exact moment, the one you felt but never named, when wakefulness begins to loosen its grip, and the brain quietly steps into a space without edges, a space where time doesn't push forward anymore. A space where nothing is required, and the question is no longer, what should I do next? But something much softer. What happens when I stop trying to stay awake? You don't fall asleep all at once. That idea comes from stories, not from the body. What actually happens is quieter than that. You drift, and drifting has no clear beginning. There is a moment, often unnoticed, where wakefulness stops holding its shape. Not gone, just softened, like a solid becoming warm enough to bend, but not yet melt. This moment has no marker, no sound, no signal, which is why so many people miss it. They think they are still awake because they can still hear. They think they are not asleep because they can still think. But the brain does not measure sleep the way we do. For the brain, sleep does not begin with unconsciousness. It begins with permission. Permission to stop monitoring the world. Right now, your brain is deciding how much of reality it still needs to keep online. During the day, it keeps almost everything active. Sounds are labeled, light is measured, time is tracked precisely. But here, in this slow descent, the brain starts asking a different question. What can I safely let go of? It starts small. Edges blur first, not visually, but conceptually. The sharp line between one thought and the next begins to dissolve. Ideas don't end cleanly anymore. They trail off, fade, overlap. You might notice a sentence in your head that never finishes, a thought that begins confidently and then quietly disappears. That's not distraction. That's the brain testing the boundary, because there is a fragile zone, a narrow strip of experience, where being awake no longer feels necessary, but being asleep hasn't taken over yet. This is the threshold, and the threshold is unstable. If you pull at it, it snaps back. If you ignore it, it deepens, which is why effort breaks it. Trying to sleep tightens the grip of wakefulness. Trying to relax keeps the observer alive. The brain reads effort as relevance, and relevance means stay alert. So instead, the brain looks for something else. It looks for stillness without intention. That's why boredom sometimes feels like sleep. Why repetitive sounds make time disappear. Why familiar silence can feel heavy instead of empty. The brain is not shutting down. It is turning away. Away from the outside, away from tasks, away from future planning, away from explanation. This turning away is gradual, and it happens layer by layer. First, the brain stops predicting what comes next. Then, it stops correcting itself. Then, it stops caring whether a thought makes sense, meaning loosens. You may notice that memories begin to behave differently here. They don't arrive as stories. They arrive as textures, a temperature, a pressure in the chest, a color without a source. The brain is no longer retrieving information. It is re-experiencing fragments. This is why the threshold feels intimate. You're not thinking about your life anymore. You're brushing against it, lightly, briefly, without judgment. And because judgment is quiet, time stretches, not forward, sideways. A minute does not feel like a minute here. It feels like a pocket, a soft container where nothing needs to move. This is also why anxiety sometimes spikes at this stage. Not because something is wrong, but because the brain is losing its usual anchors. Control is fading, structure is thinning, and for a brain trained to manage, this can feel unfamiliar. So it checks once more. It sends a thought up to the surface, a question, a memory, a small concern, just to see if you respond. If you chase it, the lights come back on. If you let it float past, the brain learns something important. It learns that it is safe to continue. And when it feels safe, it does something remarkable. It stops trying to keep you awake, not abruptly, gently, as if setting something down instead of dropping it. Breathing becomes less observed. Sounds lose their distance. Your sense of where you are in the room becomes vague, not gone, just irrelevant. You are still here, but you are no longer centered. This is not sleep yet. This is the borderland, the place where consciousness thins but does not disappear, where the brain is still active but no longer directed. And in this place, something subtle begins to happen. The brain starts to reorganize itself, not through logic, not through intention, but through association, through quiet connections that only appear when no one is watching. In the next part, we'll move deeper into that process, into what the brain chooses to do when it no longer has instructions, when no task remains, when nothing is expected of it at all. Because once the threshold is crossed, the brain does not rest, it wanders. When the brain no longer has a task, it doesn't become quiet, it becomes curious. This is something most people misunderstand. We imagine rest as emptiness, silence as nothing happening, sleep as a shutdown. But the brain was never built to stop. It was built to redirect. All day long, your brain is pointed outward. It scans, it responds, it predicts what might be needed next. Even when you think you're doing nothing, it is still working for the world around you. But now, as the night deepens and the threshold loosens its grip, that outward orientation fades. The brain turns inward, and when it does, it doesn't ask, "What should I do?" It asks something far more basic. What's left? Not in a dramatic sense. Not in a philosophical one, just what remains unresolved. When there are no emails to answer, no faces to read, no expectations to meet, the brain finally has access to the things it postponed. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. These aren't the thoughts you scheduled time for. They are the ones that don't fit neatly into daylight. A feeling you didn't have words for. A moment that didn't seem significant at the time. A reaction that arrived too late. The brain holds on to these quietly, like items placed on a table for later. And night is later. This is why your mind can feel unexpectedly busy when you're supposed to be winding down. Not busy with plans, busy with leftovers. The brain begins sorting, not logically, not consciously, but through association. One thought brushes against another. A memory pulls a sensation with it. A sensation pulls a different memory. There is no sequence here, only proximity. Things that feel similar begin to cluster. A heaviness in the chest may pull up a memory of a room. That room may pull up a voice. That voice may dissolve into nothing before you know why it appeared. This isn't randomness. It's the brain exploring without supervision. During the day, the brain is corrected constantly. That's not relevant. That can wait. That doesn't make sense. At night, those filters loosen, not because the brain is careless, but because it finally can be. And when the filters loosen, something interesting happens. The brain stops prioritizing importance and starts prioritizing charge. Not emotional charge in a loud way. Subtle charge, the kind you feel before you know what you feel. A slight tightening, a faint pull of attention, a sense that something matters without knowing why. This is why certain memories surface at night that never appear during the day. They don't compete well in daylight. They're too quiet, too incomplete, too unresolved. But here, in this slower rhythm, they finally have space. You might notice that these thoughts don't ask for action. They don't demand solutions. They simply appear and wait, as if the brain is placing them in front of you and asking gently, "Can this be put away now?" Often, the answer comes without words. You don't analyze. You don't judge. You let the thought pass. And that passing, that non-response, is itself a response. The brain registers it as closure, not final closure, not resolution, but enough to move the thought from the front of the shelf to somewhere deeper. This is part of how the brain lightens its load before sleep, not by solving everything, but by deciding what no longer needs immediate attention. And the decision is not conscious. It happens through feeling, through whether a thought pulls you forward or lets you sink. You may notice that as this happens, your sense of self begins to soften. You're still present, but you're less defined. Thoughts don't feel like yours in the same way. They feel more like weather passing through, observed but not owned. This is important, because ownership requires effort. And effort is what keeps wakefulness alive. As the brain continues this quiet sorting, it gradually reduces the need for a central observer. You don't need to watch every thought anymore. Nothing bad happens if you don't. So the brain begins to loosen its grip on you as the witness. Awareness becomes diffuse, spread out, less focused on a single point. And in that diffusion, the boundary between one thought and the next becomes harder to detect. Ideas begin to overlap, memories blur into sensations. Time loses its markers. You may feel like you're drifting, not forward, not backward, but downward, not falling, settling. This is the brain moving into a mode where efficiency is no longer about speed, but about balance. And balance requires letting go of precision. In the next part, we'll move closer to one of the strangest things the brain does at night. Why the memories it chooses to revisit are often inaccurate, unfinished, or slightly wrong. And why that is not a flaw, but a feature. The brain does not replay memories at night the way they actually happened. It never has. What it brings back to you now is not a recording, it's a reconstruction. And reconstructions are always imperfect. During the day, memory is treated like a tool. It's expected to be accurate, useful, efficient. You remember facts to function, sequences to plan, details to avoid mistakes. But at night, memory has a different purpose. Accuracy becomes optional. What matters instead is relevance to the present state. That's why the memories that surface here often feel strange. A childhood scene without a clear ending, a face without a name, a place that feels real but doesn't exist anymore. You might notice details missing or altered. The color of a wall feels wrong. The timing doesn't line up. Someone is there who shouldn't be, or missing when they should be present. The brain isn't failing, it's simplifying. When no one is watching, the brain stops preserving memories for truth and starts preserving them for function. At this stage of the night, function means one thing: reducing load. Every memory carries weight, not emotional weight necessarily, but cognitive weight, connections, associations, unfinished links. The brain cannot rest while those links remain tense, so it loosens them. It blurs edges, removes sharp corners, softens timelines. This is why nighttime memories feel less solid. They are being handled differently. Imagine a room filled with objects that were once important. During the day, the brain keeps them neatly labeled. This goes here. That belongs there. Don't mix these two. At night, the labels fall off. Objects are picked up, turned over, set down somewhere else, not randomly, by feel. You may notice that a memory arrives without its emotional reaction, or with a reaction that feels muted. That's intentional. Strong emotion keeps memories anchored. It makes them hard to move. So the brain lowers the volume first. It detaches the feeling from the image, or the image from the story. What remains is a fragment, and fragments are easier to relocate. This is why you can think about something painful at night without the same intensity you feel during the day. Not because it stopped mattering, but because the brain is preparing it for storage. Long-term storage does not require sharpness. It requires stability. And stability is easier to achieve when things are vague. As this process continues, you may feel a sense of distance from your own past. Not detachment, just space. The events feel farther away, not in time, but in ownership. They don't grip you, they float. This floating is a signal. It tells the brain that the memory can be handled safely, that it no longer needs to be guarded. And once a memory is safe, the brain can decide where to place it. Not consciously, not deliberately, but through repetition and fading. Memories that return again and again in this state are not being replayed for you. They are being reshaped. Each pass strips away unnecessary detail. Each return smooths the edges further, until eventually what remains is not the event, but the lesson, not the face, but the feeling, not the moment, but the meaning the brain extracted from it. And meaning is lighter than detail, which is why the brain prefers it when preparing for sleep. You might notice that your thoughts are becoming slower now, not because you are tired, because fewer details remain to process. The mind is no longer juggling complete scenes, only impressions. And impressions don't require language. They don't need explanation. They simply exist until they don't. This is also why words may start to feel unnecessary. You may hear the voice of this recording, but not feel the need to follow each sentence. That's fine. The brain is already shifting away from linear understanding. It is moving towards something older, something quieter. In the next part, we'll look at what guides this process, because the brain does not choose which memories to soften based on logic. It chooses them based on something far more subtle, something you've been feeling this entire time without needing to name it. The brain does not choose memories at night by importance. It chooses them by feeling. This is difficult to accept because during the day we are trained to believe that memory is logical, that it follows relevance, usefulness, priority, that the mind keeps what matters and discards what does not. But here, in this slower territory, logic has very little authority. What guides the brain now is something quieter, charge, not emotional intensity in the obvious sense, not joy or fear or sadness as labels, but a low-level pull, a subtle tension that never fully released. That is what draws certain memories back to the surface. You may notice this if you pay attention, though pay attention is already too active a phrase for this hour. Some memories arrive gently. Others hover at the edge of awareness without fully forming. You don't decide to think about them. They present themselves, and when they do, they don't arrive as complete stories. They arrive as sensations first, a tightness behind the eyes, a warmth in the chest, a faint pressure in the stomach. Only after that does an image sometimes follow, and only after the image does a context appear, if it appears at all. This order matters because it reveals how the brain is operating now. During the day, sensation follows thought. At night, thought follows sensation. The brain is no longer building meaning from ideas. It is building ideas from feeling. This is why nighttime thinking feels irrational, personal, and strangely accurate all at once. Accurate not in detail, but in tone. A memory might be distorted. The facts may be wrong. The sequence may be broken, but the feeling is precise. That precision is what the brain is interested in, because feelings are signals. They tell the brain what still carries unresolved energy. Not unresolved problems, unresolved states, something that did not complete its arc, something that began but never fully settled. The brain does not like unfinished states, not because they are unpleasant, but because they consume resources. They remain active in the background. They pull attention subtly, even when you are not aware of them. So, at night, when the world stops making demands, the brain finally has room to deal with these lingering charges. It brings them forward, quietly to see what happens. And what happens depends on how you respond. If you analyze, the brain marks the memory as active. If you resist, it marks it as threatening. If you engage emotionally, it marks it as unresolved. But if you allow it to pass without interference, something different happens. The brain interprets that neutrality as safety. Safety means this does not require protection, and once protection is no longer required, the brain can begin to reassign the memory, not erase it, reposition it. This is where nighttime memory processing becomes less about remembering and more about reweighting. Memories are not stored equally. Some sit near the surface, easily triggered. Others are buried deeper, harder to access. The depth is not determined by age. A memory from yesterday can be deeper than one from childhood. Depth is determined by relevance to current identity, and identity at night loosens. The boundaries of who you are during the day begin to soften. You are no longer actively maintaining roles. You are not being yourself. You are simply existing. In this state, memories are evaluated differently. The brain asks a quiet question. Does this still define you? Not verbally, not consciously, but through sensation. If a memory still produces a strong pull, it remains close. If the pull weakens, if the feeling can exist without reaction, the memory is allowed to sink. You might notice this sinking as a kind of fading. A thought arrives, stays briefly, then loses its shape, not pushed away, not resolved, just less present. This fading is not loss, it is placement. The brain is not forgetting, it is deciding distance, and distance is what allows sleep to deepen, because as long as memories remain close to the surface, they keep the brain alert. They whisper, they nudge, they ask for recognition. But as they are placed farther away, their signal weakens. The brain no longer needs to monitor them actively. This is why certain nights feel lighter than others, not because nothing came up, but because what came up was allowed to move. There is another subtle shift that happens here. As memories lose their sharpness, the sense of time begins to dissolve further. Past and present stop feeling distinct. A memory from years ago can feel closer than something from earlier today. This is not confusion. It is the brain stepping out of chronological organization. Time, like logic, is a daytime tool. At night, the brain organizes by association, not sequence. This is why thoughts jump without explanation. A childhood room leads to a recent conversation. A recent conversation leads to a feeling with no image. That feeling dissolves into silence. The brain is not telling a story. It is tracing connections. And as these connections are traced and then released, something important happens to the body. Muscle tone reduces, not dramatically, just enough. The jaw loosens, the shoulders sink slightly, the space behind the eyes grows heavy. These are not signals of sleep yet. They are signals of trust. The nervous system is receiving a message. Nothing urgent is happening. Nothing requires immediate response. You do not need to stay fully assembled. And when the nervous system receives this message consistently, it begins to shift dominance. Alertness gives way to maintenance. Breathing becomes less monitored. Heartbeat becomes less noticed. External sounds lose their edges. The brain, sensing this shift, becomes even less interested in clarity. It no longer tries to make sense of what arises. It lets impressions exist briefly, then lets them go. This letting go is not an action. It is an absence of interference, which is why it cannot be forced. The moment you try to let go, effort returns, and with it, wakefulness. So instead, the brain waits for stillness to happen naturally, and stillness happens when there is nothing left to hold. As this chapter of the night continues, the memories that appear will become increasingly incomplete. Images may flicker without context. Sensations may appear without source. Thoughts may begin but never finish. This is not deterioration, it is simplification. The brain is reducing complexity in preparation for a deeper shift, a shift where memory will no longer arrive as fragments, but as patterns, where individual moments blur into themes, and themes require even less attention. In the next part, we'll move into that territory, where memory stops behaving like a collection of moments and begins behaving like a landscape the brain moves through quietly, without needing you to follow every step. And as that happens, staying awake will require more effort than letting go, which is exactly where the brain wants you to be. Before a memory ever becomes an image, before it turns into a place or a face or a moment, it arrives as something quieter, a sensation. This is the part most people never notice. Because sensations don't announce themselves. They don't come with explanations. They don't say what they belong to. They simply appear. A slight pressure behind the forehead, a warmth spreading slowly through the chest, a heaviness that settles somewhere you can't quite point to. At first, it doesn't feel like memory at all. It feels physical, and that is exactly the point. At night, the brain reverses its usual order. During the day, thoughts lead and the body follows. You think something, and then you feel something. Here, in this dim interior space, the body speaks first. The brain listens to sensation before it listens to ideas. This is why nighttime memories often feel intrusive. They don't ask permission. They don't knock. They surface through the body, not the mind. A tightness appears, and only later do you realize it's connected to something you once said. A wave of warmth arrives, and only afterward does a familiar scene drift into view. Sometimes the image never comes at all. Only the feeling remains, and the brain is perfectly fine with that, because the image is optional. The sensation is not. Sensations are data. They tell the brain what still carries weight, not emotional drama, but unfinished processing. A sensation without a clear source is like a loose thread. The brain notices it immediately, not urgently. Curiously, it brings the sensation closer, not to analyze it, but to see what happens if it stays. Does it intensify? Does it fade? Does it transform into something else? This observation happens without language. You are not doing it. The brain is. You are simply present enough not to interrupt. And that presence, quiet, non-directive, allows the process to continue. If the sensation fades on its own, the brain learns something important. It learns that the memory attached to it no longer requires attention. If the sensation deepens slightly, the brain may invite an image, not a full scene, just enough context to understand the texture of the feeling, a color, a sound, a fragment of a place. This is why nighttime imagery feels incomplete. The brain is not trying to recreate reality. It is trying to locate the source of a sensation. Once the source is identified, even vaguely, the brain can decide what to do with it. And most of the time, what it does is surprisingly gentle. It does not confront, it does not resolve, it does not relive. It acknowledges. Acknowledgement at this level does not require words. It simply requires that the sensation be allowed to exist without resistance. Resistance sharpens sensation. Allowance softens it. You may notice this happening now. A feeling appears. You don't chase it. You don't push it away. You let it sit. And after a moment, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, it shifts, it loosens, it changes temperature, or it disappears entirely. When this happens, the brain marks the process as complete. Not complete in the sense of solved, complete in the sense of no longer active. This is how nighttime processing conserves energy. It does not aim for clarity. It aims for quiet resolution. Resolution that does not require narrative. This is why many people wake up feeling different without knowing why. Something moved during the night, something settled. But because it never became a clear thought, it leaves no conscious trace, only a subtle lightness, or sometimes a subtle absence of heaviness. As the night deepens, sensations become even more dominant. Thoughts thin out. Language becomes less necessary. You may notice that even understanding feels optional now. You can hear words without following them, feel meaning without forming conclusions. This is not losing awareness. It is awareness changing shape. The brain is shifting into a mode where the body becomes the primary interface. Signals come from inside rather than outside. Heart rhythm, breath depth, muscle tone. These signals are constant. They do not surprise the brain, they reassure it. Consistency is calming. Predictability allows letting go. And as the brain settles into these internal rhythms, sensations that once felt distinct begin to blend. The boundary between one feeling and the next softens. Warmth merges with heaviness. Pressure blends into stillness. There is less contrast, and less contrast means fewer alerts. The brain thrives on contrast. It wakes up for sharp changes. Smoothness tells it there is nothing to monitor. This is why repetitive sensations are so effective at inducing sleep, not because they are boring, but because they are non-threatening. The brain does not need to keep watch. It does not need to intervene. So it steps back. As it steps back, the sense of a central you begins to thin, not disappear, diffuse. You are no longer located behind your eyes. You're spread across the body, across the breath, across the faint hum of being alive. This diffusion makes it harder for specific memories to anchor themselves. There is no single point to grab onto. Thoughts that attempt to form simply dissolve into sensation again. And this is exactly what allows deeper states to approach. The brain is preparing to hand control over to slower systems, systems that do not think in images or words, systems that operate in cycles and waves. But before it can do that fully, it performs one more quiet check. It listens for lingering sensations that still spike. Anything sharp, anything unresolved enough to demand clarity. If it finds one, it may gently bring it forward, not to disturb you, but to see if it can be softened too. This is why sometimes, just as you feel yourself drifting, a sensation briefly intensifies. A sudden awareness of the chest, a quick tightening of the throat, a flicker of alertness. This is not failure. It is the brain making sure nothing important is being ignored. If you remain still, if you do not react, the brain learns again. It learns that even this can be allowed, and once that learning settles, the need for checking fades. At this point, sensations begin to lose their edges entirely. They become background, a field rather than points. You're no longer experiencing individual signals. You're experiencing state, a state of low demand, low differentiation, high safety. In this state, memory behaves differently once again. It no longer arrives as fragments tied to sensations. It begins to reorganize at a higher level, patterns instead of moments, themes instead of events. The brain stops asking, "What is this from?" and starts asking something else, something much quieter. What does this belong with? In the next part, we'll move into that shift where memories stop surfacing as isolated impressions and begin arranging themselves into broader landscapes, not places you visit consciously, but terrains the brain moves through as it prepares to let go of wakefulness altogether. And by then, staying with the sound of this voice may feel optional, which is exactly how the night prefers it. As the night continues, memories stop arriving one by one. They begin to gather. Not into stories, not into timelines, into landscapes. This is a subtle transition and most people never notice it happening. Because nothing dramatic changes, there is no clear signal, no internal announcement, just a quiet shift in how the mind holds experience. Earlier, memories appeared like fragments, a sensation here, an image there, loose pieces, briefly illuminated, then gone. Now those pieces begin to lose their individuality. They merge, not into clarity, but into atmosphere. You may notice this as a general sense rather than a thought, a sense of familiarity without a specific place, a mood that doesn't belong to any single event, a feeling that seems older than memory, but younger than identity. This is the brain stepping back from detail. Detail is expensive. It requires attention, precision, effort. Landscapes are efficient. A landscape can hold many memories at once without activating any of them fully. And efficiency is exactly what the brain is seeking now. During the day, the brain zooms in. At night, it zooms out. It stops asking, "What happened?" and starts asking, "What kind of place is this?" Not a physical place, an internal one, a pattern of experience, a terrain made of repeated feelings, familiar tensions, known comforts. Think of how certain periods of your life feel when you remember them. Not what happened, but how it felt to exist then. That feeling is a landscape, and landscapes don't need details to be real. They only need consistency. At night, the brain groups memories based on emotional climate rather than content. Moments that share a similar tone drift closer together, not because they are related in time, but because they resonate. A memory from childhood and a moment from last week may sit side by side if they carry the same underlying sensation. The brain is not confused by this, it finds it logical. Because for the brain, feeling is the connective tissue, and when memories become landscapes, something important happens to consciousness. You stop moving through thoughts and begin resting within them, not inside a specific memory, inside a state, a gentle sadness without a cause, a calm familiarity with no source, a soft sense of distance that doesn't hurt. These states don't demand anything. They don't ask to be fixed or understood. They simply exist. And because they exist without urgency, the brain no longer needs to keep you sharply aware. Awareness can soften. You might notice now that your sense of here is less precise. The room feels farther away. The body feels less defined. You're still present, but you're no longer located. This is not dissociation. It is redistribution. Awareness is spreading out, no longer concentrated behind the eyes. The brain does this deliberately. A single focal point requires maintenance. Distributed awareness does not. This is why people often describe this stage as floating, drifting, or sinking. There is no direction, just reduced effort. As landscapes replace fragments, the brain's relationship to memory changes again. It no longer needs to check individual items. It evaluates whole regions at once. Is this landscape safe? Is it stable? Does it need attention? Most of the time, the answer is no, because landscapes that appear at night are rarely volatile. They are familiar. You have visited them many times before, even if you didn't know it. They are composed of repeated experiences, patterns that have already been survived. The brain recognizes this familiarity and relaxes further. It does not need to prepare you for action. There is nothing new to respond to here. This is one reason nighttime thinking can feel oddly comforting, even when it carries sadness. Sadness without surprise is not a threat. It is known territory, and known territory allows rest. As the brain settles into these internal landscapes, time loses even more structure. There is no sequence to follow, no progression to track. Moments no longer feel separate. You may feel as if you've been here for a long time, or no time at all. Both impressions are equally true. Time at this stage is no longer being measured. Measurement requires comparison. Comparison requires reference points. Reference points have dissolved. Instead, there is duration without direction. This is deeply calming to the nervous system, because urgency depends on time. When time stops pushing forward, urgency fades. The body responds quickly to this. Breathing becomes slower, not because you intend it to, but because there is no reason to hurry. The muscles that keep you subtly alert during the day begin to release, not all at once, in waves, small adjustments that you may not consciously notice. The tongue rests. The jaw loosens further. The eyes stop tracking. These changes are not signals of sleep yet. They are signals of non-vigilance. The brain is no longer scanning for change. It is satisfied with sameness, and sameness is the doorway to deeper states. As this sameness stabilizes, thoughts lose their ability to form complete arcs. You may begin to notice that ideas don't fully develop. They start and then dissolve back into the landscape. There is no frustration in this, because nothing is expected to finish. Completion is a daytime value. Here, continuity is enough. This is also why it becomes harder to remember what you were just thinking about. Not because memory is failing, but because memory is no longer being segmented. There are no edges to mark, no beginning, no end. Just a field. And fields don't store individual paths. They store conditions. The brain is now operating at a level where it can prepare for deeper phases without your involvement. It has gathered what it needs. It has softened what could interfere. It has grouped what belongs together. Soon, it will begin to disengage from conscious experience more fully. But before it does, it performs another quiet evaluation, not of thoughts, not of memories, of safety. It checks whether this internal environment is stable enough to let go, whether nothing sharp remains, nothing demanding, nothing unresolved enough to pull you back to the surface. If the landscape remains calm, if no spikes appear, the brain takes that as permission. Permission to move into rhythms that no longer require awareness at all. In the next part, we'll move closer to that transition, to the point where consciousness doesn't disappear, but thins so much that it no longer needs a center, where experience continues, but no one is required to witness it. And once that happens, the question of whether you are awake or asleep will stop mattering, because the brain will already be somewhere else. At this stage of the night, the brain is no longer interested in content, not thoughts, not memories, not even landscapes. What it is paying attention to now is something far more basic: stability. The brain is constantly asking one quiet question: is anything about to require action? During the day, the answer is almost always yes. A sound might mean danger, a thought might require planning, a sensation might signal a problem. So the brain stays alert. But here, in this slow interior space, the signals have changed. Nothing sharp has appeared for a while. Nothing new has demanded interpretation. Nothing has pulled you forward. And that absence is not ignored. It is noticed. When the brain notices sustained absence of demand, it begins a careful withdrawal. Not a shutdown, a handover. It starts reducing the resources allocated to conscious monitoring. Awareness doesn't disappear, it thins, like fog spreading evenly instead of light, focusing into a beam. You might notice that you're no longer following the voice of this recording. You still hear it, but you don't track every sentence. Meaning arrives in waves rather than lines. This is not inattention, it is redistribution. The brain no longer needs a narrator. It doesn't need a central observer to confirm that everything is okay. It has already confirmed it. So it loosens the structure that keeps awareness tightly organized. And when structure loosens, experience becomes flatter, but wider. There's less contrast between inside and outside. Sounds don't feel as far away. Sensations don't feel as localized. Your body may feel both present and distant at the same time. This is not confusion. It is the brain stepping out of spatial precision. Spatial precision is expensive. It requires constant updates. Here, updates are unnecessary. Nothing is changing quickly enough to matter, so the brain lets space blur. You may feel larger than your body, or smaller, or not particularly located anywhere. All of these impressions are common. None of them require interpretation. They are simply signs that spatial mapping is being deprioritized. At the same time, the brain begins to smooth internal rhythms. Breathing settles into a pattern that no longer needs observation. Heart rate becomes less variable. The subtle muscle tension that keeps you ready to move fades further. These changes are not commands. They are responses. Responses to an environment, internal and external, that has proven itself safe. Safety is the single most important condition for the next transition. Without it, the brain will not proceed. With it, the brain begins to do something very specific. It starts closing loops. Not consciously, not deliberately. Loops that were left open earlier in the night. Residual activations, small spikes of alertness that never fully discharged. The brain revisits them briefly, one by one, often so quickly that you never register what they were connected to. You may notice this as a faint flutter of thought, a brief tightening, then nothing. These are not interruptions. They are confirmations. Each time one resolves without escalation, the brain marks another area as safe. This process is cumulative. The longer the environment remains stable, the more confidence the brain builds, and confidence allows deeper disengagement. As this happens, even the landscapes from earlier begin to flatten. They lose depth. They become background texture rather than places you could enter. Emotion becomes neutralized, not erased, but equalized. Nothing stands out enough to pull focus. This is why some people describe this stage as blank, even though experience hasn't stopped. It's not blankness, it's uniformity. Uniformity does not attract attention, and attention is what keeps wakefulness alive. You may notice that intention feels distant now. Trying to decide something feels strange, almost impossible. Not because your mind is tired, but because the systems that support intention are being powered down. Decision-making requires contrast, options, evaluation. Here, everything feels the same, so there is nothing to choose between. This is deeply calming to the brain. Choice is work. The absence of choice is rest. At this point, even the sense of listening may fade. The voice may blend into the background like a familiar sound you no longer register. This is not losing the thread. It is no longer needing one. The brain has moved into a state where continuity exists without narrative. Experience flows without being segmented into moments. There is no now followed by next, just ongoing presence. And presence without structure does not require wakefulness. This is the last condition the brain checks before allowing deeper systems to take over. Is there anything that still needs to be watched? If the answer remains no, and for most people, by this point, it does, the brain begins to disengage the final layer of conscious oversight, not abruptly, gradually. Like dimming lights rather than switching them off. Thoughts, if they appear at all, will be extremely simple. Not ideas, not memories, just impulses, a word fragment, a vague image, a sense of motion. They don't connect. They don't continue. They flicker and dissolve. This flickering is not dreaming yet. It is the pre-dream state, the moment where consciousness is still present enough to notice, but no longer stable enough to hold. If you were to try to grasp a thought here, it would slip away immediately, not because it is fragile, but because grasping is no longer supported. The brain has removed the machinery that allows holding, and without holding, there is nothing to stay awake with. Soon, the brain will cross another threshold. One where experience continues without reference to the waking self, where patterns replace awareness, where time becomes irrelevant altogether. But before that happens fully, there is a brief interval, a soft suspension, where nothing needs to happen, and nothing does. In the next part, we'll move into that interval, the place where consciousness becomes thin enough to disappear without you noticing, where sleep does not arrive as an event, but as a quiet absence of the need to remain here, even now when almost everything has softened, when thoughts no longer insist on being followed, when the body has learned that nothing is required of it. There are still a few things the brain does not release easily, not because they are large, not because they are dramatic, but because they never found a place to land. These are not memories that shout. They don't arrive with urgency or emotion. They appear as quiet resistance, a faint pull backward, a subtle tightness that doesn't fully dissolve, a sense that something is still slightly unfinished, without knowing what. The brain notices this immediately. It does not panic. It does not rush. It pauses, because before it can let go completely, it needs to understand one thing: what still matters just enough to stay close. During the day, these things are invisible. They hide behind activity, behind conversation, behind motion. They are too small to interrupt productivity. But at night, when everything else has stepped aside, they finally have space to be felt. These are the thoughts you never think directly. The almost words, the moments that end just before they become stories. A sentence you didn't finish saying, a reaction you swallowed, a choice you made automatically and never revisited. They don't feel emotional at first. They feel incomplete. And incompleteness is uncomfortable for the brain, not consciously but structurally. The brain is built to resolve patterns. Open loops consume energy. They require monitoring. So when the night quiets everything else, the brain brings these lingering fragments closer, not to relive them, but to check whether they still need to be held. You may notice this as a gentle return of specificity. After all the diffusion, all the flattening, something suddenly feels more defined, not sharp, just present. A vague memory gains a little clarity. A sensation gains a faint context. The brain is asking, can this be put away now? It asks, not with words, but by allowing the fragment to exist a little more fully. If the fragment escalates, if emotion spikes, if urgency returns, the brain marks it as active and pulls back. Not now, too much. But if the fragment remains calm, if it can exist without demanding response, the brain takes that as permission. Permission to settle it deeper. This is why these moments often feel strangely neutral. You may recognize something, but not feel compelled to react. That neutrality is crucial. It tells the brain that the fragment no longer threatens balance. So it begins the final stage of release. Not erasure, reclassification. The brain moves the fragment from the category of unfinished to the category of known. Known things do not require vigilance. They do not need to stay near the surface. They can be stored quietly. This is where many people misunderstand nighttime processing. They think the brain is trying to resolve these lingering moments. It is not. Resolution implies explanation, understanding, closure. The brain does not need any of that. It needs containment, a place where the fragment can exist without interfering. Once that place is found, the brain loosens its grip. You may feel this loosening as a subtle release in the body. A muscle that relaxes without you noticing it was tense. A breath that deepened slightly on its own. A sense of space opening somewhere inside. This is not emotional relief. It is structural relief. The nervous system registers that something has moved from foreground to background. As this happens, the brain performs a quiet check. It scans again. Is there anything else still resisting? Anything still sharp enough to require attention? Often, there is one last thing, not a memory, a theme, a recurring tone that has followed you across many experiences. Not sadness itself, but a certain shade of it. Not anxiety, but a subtle readiness that never fully turns off. These themes are not tied to single events. They are patterns the brain has learned over time. They are harder to release because they are familiar. Familiarity feels safe, even when it is heavy. So the brain does not attempt to remove these themes. Instead, it changes how close they are allowed to be. It reduces their volume, their contrast, their ability to stand out. This is why some nights feel quieter than others without any clear reason. Nothing new was resolved. Nothing dramatic shifted. Something simply moved farther away. And distance for the brain is enough. As this final reclassification settles, the brain's need to monitor decreases sharply. There are fewer open loops now, fewer fragments near the surface, fewer reasons to stay alert. Awareness thins even more, not suddenly, gently, like weight slowly leaving something you didn't realize you were holding. At this point, it may become difficult to recall what you were just thinking about. Not because you are forgetting, but because the brain is no longer tagging experiences for retrieval. Tagging requires intent. Intent is fading. The brain is preparing to transition fully, not into sleep yet, but into a state where the self is no longer the organizer of experience. Before that happens, there is one last thing the brain often does. It checks for connection, not to the outside world, to itself. It makes sure that nothing essential has been lost in the letting go, that the system is coherent, that the body is stable, that the internal environment is predictable. This check is fast, almost instantaneous, and once it passes, the brain no longer needs to keep you involved. Consciousness becomes optional. Experience continues without commentary. The sense of I am here loosens further, not disappearing, but no longer necessary. In the next part, we'll move into what happens when the brain stops needing a central observer, when experience is no longer something you have, but something that simply unfolds, where the dialogue inside your head gives way to something quieter, something without words, something that does not ask to be understood, only allowed. There is a moment when the brain stops speaking to you, not abruptly, not dramatically. It simply stops directing its voice at a listener. Until now, even as everything softened, there was still a sense, however faint, that thoughts were being presented to someone, that experiences were being noticed, that something inside was keeping track. But here, that structure begins to dissolve. The brain no longer needs an audience. This is not silence. It is the end of dialogue. During waking life, your mind is built around conversation, even when you are alone. A question appears, an answer forms, an image arrives, followed by commentary. This inner exchange is constant. It's how the brain maintains coherence. But coherence requires energy. And now, with most demands already released, the brain looks at this final exchange and asks, is this still necessary? The answer, increasingly, is no. So the brain begins to withdraw language from experience. Words thin out, sentences shorten, if they appear at all. Thoughts no longer arrive fully formed. They emerge as impulses, directions without destinations, movements without meaning. You may notice that ideas now feel unfinished from the moment they begin. A word forms, then fades. An image flashes, then dissolves. A sense of intention arises, then loses momentum. This is not distraction, it is deconstruction. The brain is dismantling the scaffolding of conscious thought, and it does so carefully, layer by layer, because the inner voice is not just for thinking, it is also for orientation. It tells you who you are, where you are, what time it is, what matters. Removing it too quickly would feel disorienting, so the brain lets it weaken gradually. The voice becomes softer, less insistent, less personal, until eventually it is no longer addressing you at all. It becomes background noise, then texture, then nothing you can point to. This is the moment many people describe as losing themselves, but nothing is lost. Something is being returned to a state that existed before language took over, before identity needed constant reinforcement, before experience required narration. You may notice now that the sense of self feels different, not gone, but less central. You are no longer at the center of experience. Experience is simply happening. Breath continues without being noticed. Sounds enter and exit without being labeled. Sensations arise without being claimed. There is no longer a clear boundary between what is happening to you and what is happening as you. This is not detachment, it is integration. The brain is no longer separating observer and observed. It has determined that distinction is unnecessary right now. This shift changes the quality of awareness completely. Awareness becomes non-directional. It doesn't point. It doesn't focus. It spreads evenly, like light diffused through fog rather than aimed through a lens. In this state, attention no longer jumps. There is nothing to jump to. Everything feels equally distant or equally close. Time, which relied on sequence and narration, loosens even further. You may have no sense of how long you've been here, not because time stopped, but because nothing is marking it. Moments are no longer being counted. They are blending. And when moments blend, urgency disappears. Urgency requires a future, a next step. Here, there is no next step, only continuation. The brain recognizes this condition as optimal for letting go. It no longer needs to check for meaning. Meaning has become irrelevant. What matters now is rhythm, the rhythm of breath, the rhythm of internal cycles, the slow oscillation of neural activity. These rhythms do not need supervision. They have existed long before conscious thought, and they know how to proceed without it. As the brain aligns with these slower patterns, consciousness thins again, not in content, but in density. Awareness feels lighter, less anchored. If a thought appears now, it does not pull attention with it. It floats through like a ripple, then disappears into the field. There is no impulse to follow. Following would require intention. Intention is offline. This is the stage where many people feel they are about to fall asleep. But falling is the wrong word. There is no movement, no transition you can feel. What is actually happening is subtraction. Less self, less structure, less need. Nothing new is being added. The brain is simply removing what is no longer required. And what remains is remarkably simple. Existence without commentary, presence without position, experience without ownership. This simplicity is not emptiness, it is efficiency. The brain has reached a state where it can maintain internal stability without conscious oversight. And once that is true, consciousness becomes optional. You might still be aware, but awareness has no role to play. It is like standing in a room where everything is already in place. No adjustment needed, no observation required. At this point, even the idea of listening becomes strange. There is no one left to listen. Sounds pass through the system without being registered as events. They are vibrations, not messages. If something external were to change suddenly, a loud noise, a strong sensation, the brain could still respond. Alertness is not gone. It is simply resting. This resting alertness is very different from wakefulness. It does not scan. It does not predict. It does not evaluate. It simply maintains readiness in the background. And because readiness is no longer being actively exercised, it consumes very little energy. This is the condition the brain has been preparing for all night. The condition where it can finally release conscious control, where deeper processes can take over without interruption. Processes that reorganize memory at scale, that restore metabolic balance, that adjust internal chemistry. None of these require your involvement. In fact, your involvement would interfere, which is why the brain gently removes you from the center, not pushing you away, just letting you drift to the edge. If you try to locate yourself now, you may find it difficult, not because you are lost, but because location no longer applies. There is no center, no reference point, just ongoing activity without a witness. This is not sleep yet, but it is the final shape consciousness takes before sleep no longer needs to announce itself. In the next part, we will move into what happens when this distributed awareness begins to fragment. When continuity itself breaks into slow waves, when experience no longer flows smoothly, but pulses, and in those pulses, the last traces of wakefulness quietly dissolve. What comes next does not feel like a step forward. It feels like something loosening its grip. Up to this point, experience has still flowed, slowly, evenly, like a wide river with no visible banks. Awareness was thin but continuous. There was still a sense of ongoingness. Now, that continuity begins to break, not into chaos, into rhythm. The brain shifts from a steady stream into pulses. You may notice this as gaps, tiny absences, moments where nothing seems to be happening, followed by moments where something briefly returns. Not thoughts, not images, just presence, then absence, then presence again. This is subtle, so subtle that the mind, if it were fully awake, would try to fill the gaps. But the mind is no longer awake enough to do that, so the gaps remain. These gaps are important. They are not mistakes. They are the brain's way of testing whether continuity is still required. During wakefulness, continuity is essential. Experience must be smooth, unbroken, trackable. Any interruption triggers alarm. But here, in this deep quiet, the brain allows interruption to exist without response. And when interruption causes no harm, the brain learns something new. It learns that awareness does not need to be constant, that nothing collapses when experience briefly disappears, that the system continues even when the witness fades. This learning is crucial. Because sleep does not begin with darkness, it begins with intermittence. Consciousness flickers on, off, on again, not sharply, softly. You may notice this flickering as moments where you cannot remember what just happened. Not long stretches, just tiny slips. A sentence you don't recall hearing, a breath you don't remember taking, a few seconds that feel missing. These are not lapses, they are handovers. The brain is transferring control from systems that require awareness to systems that do not, and it does this gradually to avoid triggering alertness. Each flicker is a test. Each return is a confirmation. Is the environment still stable? Is the body still safe? Is there any reason to wake fully? If the answer remains no, the gaps widen. Presence becomes less frequent. Absence lasts a little longer, and the returns become weaker. When awareness comes back now, it does not come back with clarity. It comes back dimly. You may feel that you are here, but not fully, that you exist, but not sharply. This is not confusion. It is dilution. Awareness is being diluted across time. No single moment holds enough density to feel solid. This is why trying to stay awake here feels impossible. There is nothing to hold on to, no continuous thread. The brain has broken the line, and once the line is broken, wakefulness cannot sustain itself. Wakefulness requires continuity. It requires narrative. It requires memory from one moment to the next. Here, memory is no longer being written consistently. Moments happen, but they are not stored. They dissolve before they can be tagged. So even if awareness flickers on, it finds no context, no before, no after. Just a vague sense of being, then nothing again. As this rhythm stabilizes, the brain begins to synchronize larger systems. Neural activity slows into coordinated waves, not uniform, but patterned, rising, falling, pausing. These waves are not something you perceive directly. You experience them as heaviness, as sinking, as the feeling that effort would be required to think, and that effort is no longer available. At this stage, even the concept of effort feels distant. You are not choosing not to think. Thinking is simply not accessible. The pathways that support it are temporarily offline. This is not shutdown, it is reallocation. Resources are being redirected to processes that require isolation from awareness, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, physiological repair. These processes do not tolerate observation well. They work best when uninterrupted, which is why the brain continues widening the gaps. Awareness returns less often now, and when it does, it is vague enough not to interfere. You may experience this as a sense of floating between moments, or as the feeling of slipping away repeatedly. Each time you slip, there is no resistance, because there is nothing to resist with. The sense of self, already diffused, now begins to fragment, not break apart, fade in pieces. The idea of I may appear briefly, then fail to attach to anything, no body, no thought, no location. So it dissolves. And when the idea of I dissolves, there is no longer a reason to remain awake. Wakefulness serves the self. Without a self to serve, it becomes unnecessary. This is the quiet truth most people never notice. Sleep does not take you. You leave wakefulness, not deliberately, not consciously. You simply stop returning. The brain does not force this. It allows it. And allowance is gentle. There is no drop, no fall, just longer absences, fewer returns, until eventually awareness does not come back at all. Not because it is gone, but because there is no longer a place for it to land. Experience continues, the body continues, the brain continues, but the witness is no longer required. In the next part, we will move into what happens after awareness stops returning. When experience persists without memory, when time becomes meaningless, when the night no longer contains moments, only depth. And from that depth, the brain begins its real work. At some point, awareness stops returning, not suddenly, not noticeably. There is no final moment you can point to and say, that was it, because memory has already stepped aside. What comes next is not darkness, it is depth. Experience continues, but it no longer arranges itself into moments. There is no sequence, no before and after, no place where one thing ends and another begins. The brain has crossed into a state where time is no longer useful. Time exists to order events. Here, events are no longer being recorded. So, time loosens, then dissolves. If awareness were to appear briefly now, it would find nothing to hold on to, no narrative, no position, no reference point, which is why it doesn't appear. There is no landing surface. This is often described as deep sleep, but that name hides what is actually happening. The brain has not gone inactive. It has become internally focused in a way that excludes consciousness entirely. Not because consciousness is unwanted, but because it would interfere. What the brain is doing now requires isolation. It begins working on memory at scale. not individual memories, but entire systems, patterns of response, emotional tendencies, learned expectations. These are not adjusted through thought. They are adjusted through repetition and rhythm. Slow waves of neural activity sweep across large regions of the brain, not smoothly. In pulses, each pulse strengthens certain connections and weakens others, not based on importance, based on efficiency. Connections that fired together repeatedly during the day are reinforced. Those that remained unused are allowed to fade. This process does not feel like anything. There is no experience attached to it, and that is intentional. If it felt like something, awareness would return. So the brain keeps the work quiet. It reduces sensory input even further. External sounds may still be processed, but only at a reflexive level. No interpretation, no meaning, just detection. The body remains ready to respond if necessary, but the threshold for response is high. Only strong, sudden changes would trigger it. Everything else is filtered out. This filtering is not rigid, it is adaptive. The brain maintains a balance between rest and readiness. Too much isolation would be dangerous. Too little would prevent recovery. So it stays in a state of deep responsiveness without awareness. This is one of the most efficient states the human brain can enter. Energy consumption drops, repair mechanisms activate, hormonal systems recalibrate. The nervous system shifts from vigilance to restoration. And none of this requires your participation. In fact, participation would slow it down. This is why even the faint sense of self has been removed. There is no you here to interfere, just process, just rhythm, just depth. From the outside, nothing seems to be happening. From the inside, everything that needs to happen is happening. Without words, without images, without memory. This is why you cannot remember this part of the night. Not because it didn't occur, but because memory formation is offline. No tags are being applied, no moments are being marked. It passes without trace, and that is its purpose. Because memory is not meant to store rest. Rest is meant to restore memory. As this deep state stabilizes, the brain continues its work uninterrupted. Cycles repeat. Waves rise and fall. Each cycle further reduces residual tension. Each wave smooths the internal landscape. Eventually, the intensity of this activity begins to taper, not because it is complete, but because equilibrium has been reached. The brain does not aim for perfection. It aims for balance. Once balance is restored enough, the depth no longer needs to be maintained. Slowly, very slowly, the brain prepares for another transition, not toward waking, toward dreaming. But dreaming does not announce itself either. It emerges from the same depth as a different organization of activity. In the next part, we will move toward that emergence, toward the moment when depth gives way to imagery, when memory returns, but without logic, when the brain begins to simulate again, not for the world, but for itself. And from there, the night takes on a different texture altogether. Depth does not end, it shifts. Without warning, without signal, the brain begins to reorganize itself again, not upward, not toward wakefulness, but sideways, into simulation. The first sign of this change is not an image, it is movement. A subtle sense of motion where there was none before, not the feeling of going somewhere, but the feeling that something is beginning to move on its own. The brain has completed its deepest maintenance. Balance has been restored enough. And now, with the system stable, it allows activity to take a different form. This form is not conscious, but it is not empty either. It is generative. During deep rest, the brain quieted large regions at once. Now, it begins to activate smaller networks, carefully, selectively, while keeping the systems of awareness offline. This is important because what comes next looks like experience, but is not meant to be experienced. It is meant to be run. Images begin to appear, not clearly, not consistently. They flicker, incomplete. A shape without edges, a place without distance, a presence without identity. These are not dreams yet. They are prototypes. The brain is testing combinations, linking fragments of memory, sensation, and expectation, not to tell a story, but to explore possibilities. This is simulation without a witness. The brain does this constantly, even during the day. But during the day, simulations are constrained by reality. They must make sense. They must be useful. Here, those constraints are gone. Simulation becomes free. Images can shift without explanation. Scenes can change without cause. Time can fold without resistance, because no one is watching. And without a watcher, there is no need for continuity. This is why early dream imagery feels unstable. Things appear, then dissolve, then reappear as something else. There is no frustration in this. Frustration requires expectation. Expectation requires a self. The self is still offline, so the brain experiments. It recombines. It explores patterns in a way that would feel chaotic if you were fully aware. But here, it is efficient. These simulations are not random. They are constrained by what the brain has recently processed. Residual memory traces, emotional tones, unresolved themes, but they are freed from accuracy, from realism, from consequence. The brain is not trying to predict the world, it is trying to reorganize itself. Simulation allows it to test new configurations without risk, to weaken old connections by running them in distorted contexts, to strengthen useful patterns by repeating them subtly across many variations. All of this happens below awareness, which is why, if awareness were to return now, it would find something strange. Images without logic, movement without intention, experience without ownership. This is the threshold of dreaming, not the dramatic kind, not the kind with stories, but the quiet kind, the kind that exists only to reshape internal structure. As simulations stabilize, some begin to last longer than others, not because they are better, but because they resonate. Resonance is the brain's signal that a pattern matters, not consciously, structurally. A simulation that aligns with existing emotional networks may persist. It gains weight. It repeats, slightly modified each time. And repetition is how dreams are born. You may notice, if awareness flickers briefly here, that images seem to pull themselves together. A place becomes more consistent. A figure gains form. A sequence begins to hold. But the moment awareness notices this, it destabilizes again, which is why true dreaming requires that awareness stay away. The brain knows this, so it keeps awareness fragmented. If it returns at all, it returns weakly, unable to anchor, unable to narrate. Without narration, the simulation remains intact, and as simulations become more coherent, the brain shifts resources again. It allows emotional coloration to return, not sharply, gradually, a sense of tension, a hint of comfort, a vague familiarity. Emotion gives simulation depth. It allows the brain to test responses. How does this pattern feel? Does it activate readiness, Does it promote calm? Does it resolve or reinforce existing tendencies? These tests are not evaluated consciously. They are measured physiologically. Heart rhythm, autonomic responses, neurochemical shifts. The body participates without awareness. And because the body participates, the brain can learn. This is one reason dreams can change how you feel the next day without you remembering them. Learning occurred without memory. Adjustment without narrative. As the brain continues this process, simulations that do not produce useful responses fade. They collapse. Others persist. And when a simulation persists long enough, it becomes recognizable, not to you, but to the brain. This is when a dream becomes a dream rather than noise. But even then, it does not require a self. It requires only internal coherence. You may be tempted to imagine this as a story forming. But story is a waking concept. What actually forms is a field of consistent relationships. This thing leads to that. This presence follows that movement. This emotional tone repeats. Meaning is emergent, not assigned. And because meaning emerges slowly, awareness remains unnecessary. This is the genius of the sleeping brain. It does not try to understand. It allows structure to form organically. Only later, much later, will fragments of this structure surface as remembered dreams. And even then, they will be distorted, simplified, translated into waking language. But right now, there is no translation, only process, only exploration, only quiet construction and deconstruction happening in parallel. Time, still absent, does not interfere. Minutes and hours are irrelevant here. Cycles matter more than duration. The brain moves through phases. Simulation deepens. Emotion layers in, then softens again, over and over, each pass adjusting something subtle, each pass leaving the system slightly different than before. And all of this happens without strain, without urgency, without effort, because effort belongs to wakefulness. Here, there is only flow. Eventually, one of these simulations may grow strong enough to pull awareness closer, not fully back, just closer. A dream with shape, with movement, with emotional gravity. But even then, awareness will not arrive as a narrator. It will arrive as a participant, briefly, without memory of how it got there. That is still ahead. For now, the brain remains in this generative middle ground, no longer in deep, silent maintenance, not yet in vivid dreaming, a place of construction, of quiet rehearsal, of internal rebalancing through imagined worlds. In the next part, we will move into what happens when one of these simulations crosses a threshold, when imagery becomes strong enough to hold attention, when emotion sharpens, when the brain allows a temporary self to reassemble, not as you, but as a character within the simulation. And from there, the night will begin to take on a form you might recognize, not clearly, not reliably, but just enough to leave traces behind when morning comes. At first, the self returns quietly, not as a name, not as a story, not even as a body. It returns as position, a point of view. Until now, experience had no center. Images moved, emotions pulsed, patterns formed, but nothing belonged to anyone. Now, very slowly, something begins to orient. Not, I am here, just here. A direction appears, a sense that something is being seen rather than merely happening. This is the beginning of the dream self. Not the waking you, not the person with a history and responsibilities. A temporary configuration. A functional observer, The brain assembles when simulation reaches a certain density. The brain does this for one reason only: to test interaction. Simulations without observers can explore structure. Simulations with observers can explore response. How does it feel to move through this? What happens if this presence reacts? What patterns emerge when perception and emotion loop together? These questions are not asked, they are enacted. So the brain constructs a minimal self, just enough awareness to participate, just enough identity to respond, but not enough memory to interfere. This self has no past, no future, no external reference. It exists only within the simulation. And because it exists only there, it feels real while it lasts. You may recognize this later as the feeling of being inside a dream. But at this moment, there is no recognition. There is only involvement. Images sharpen slightly. Not fully, but enough to hold. A place gains consistency. A motion repeats. A presence feels distinct from the background. Emotion sharpens too. Not complex emotion. Simple tones, tension, curiosity, ease. These tones are essential. They guide the simulation forward. Emotion provides direction where logic is absent. The dream self moves not by choice, but by pull. Something draws attention. Something repels it. The brain watches how this unfolds, not consciously, through physiology, through pattern, through resonance. And because the self is temporary, it does not question. It does not analyze. It does not doubt. It simply responds. This is why dreams feel convincing while they happen, not because they are realistic, but because skepticism requires memory. And memory is still offline. So the dream self accepts the environment as given. A place does not need to make sense to exist. A face does not need a name to feel familiar. A sequence does not need logic to continue. The brain allows inconsistencies. It allows impossible transitions. Because consistency is not the goal. Learning is. And learning here is not about facts. It is about internal calibration. How much tension is tolerable? How quickly does curiosity turn into stress? What patterns resolve emotional charge most efficiently? These questions are answered through movement and reaction. The dream self is a probe, a sensor, a way for the brain to test internal states without risk. If the simulation becomes too intense, the brain dampens it. Images blur, emotion softens. The dream shifts. If it becomes too flat, the brain sharpens contrast, adds motion, adds presence, adds urgency. All of this happens dynamically, without your involvement. The dream self does not control the dream. It is controlled by it. This is an important distinction. Even when the dream self feels active, it is still part of the process, not the driver. The driver is the brain's need for balance, and balance is measured through response. As this phase continues, some dreams begin to organize themselves around recurring themes, not stories, motifs, a sense of searching, a feeling of being late, a movement toward or away from something unseen. These motifs are not symbolic in the poetic sense. They are structural. They reflect ongoing patterns in how the brain responds to the world, patterns that were active during the day but never fully expressed. Dreams allow expression without consequence. They allow the brain to run scenarios to completion, even if those completions are abstract. And because they run to completion, they reduce residual charge. That charge will not follow you into waking life as strongly. You may wake without remembering the dream, but with a subtle shift in mood, a lightness, a calm, a vague sense that something has settled. That settlement began here, inside a simulation you never consciously chose. As the dream unfolds, time remains distorted. Scenes may stretch or collapse. Moments may repeat. Transitions may occur without warning. None of this disrupts the dream self. Because disruption requires expectation, and expectation is still minimal. The dream self exists in a present without horizon. Only what is happening matters, and even that matters only briefly. Eventually, the brain begins to withdraw again, not fully, but partially. The dream does not end. It thins. Emotion fades first, then clarity, then the sense of being someone within it. The dream self loosens. Position dissolves. The simulation continues, but without a participant. It returns to pure process. This oscillation between simulation with a self and simulation without may repeat many times during the night. You will not notice most of them. Memory will not record them. But each one adjusts something small. Each one fine-tunes internal balance. Each one leaves the system slightly quieter, slightly more integrated. As the night moves forward, the brain will cycle between depth, simulation, and partial awareness again and again. Not linearly, not predictably, but rhythmically, and each cycle will be shaped by what the brain still needs to process, what still carries charge, what still seeks resolution, not in thought, but in pattern. In the next part, we will move toward the later hours of the night, when the balance begins to shift again, when restoration gives way to preparation, when the brain starts very gently to rebuild the structures that wakefulness will require, not by waking you, but by reintroducing the idea that there will be a morning long before you ever know it, long before waking becomes possible. The brain begins to remember that waking exists, not consciously, not deliberately. It does not think about morning. It does not imagine light or sound or movement. It simply shifts its priorities. During the deepest parts of the night, restoration came first. Balance mattered more than readiness. Isolation mattered more than awareness. But now, quietly, without interrupting sleep, the brain begins to prepare for return. This preparation does not feel like anticipation. It feels like alignment. Internal rhythms begin to change, not abruptly, not enough to wake you, just enough to signal that the environment will eventually matter again. Hormonal patterns begin to adjust. Temperature regulation subtly shifts. Neural networks that were resting deeply begin to re-engage at low intensity. None of this creates experience. There is still no observer. But the system is no longer exclusively inward. It is beginning to widen its scope. Dreams, if they occur now, change character. They become slightly longer, slightly more coherent, not because awareness has returned, but because memory systems are becoming more available. The brain is not trying to tell stories. It is rehearsing continuity. Earlier simulations were fragmented by design. Now, the brain allows them to persist a little longer, not for meaning, but for flow. Flow is important. Wakefulness depends on it. To function in the world, the brain must maintain extended sequences, cause and effect, before and after, action and response. So, during this phase of the night, the brain gently reintroduces sequence into its simulations, still without logic, still without accuracy, but with duration. A place may remain stable for longer. A situation may evolve instead of dissolving immediately. A dream self may stay present through multiple transitions. This does not mean the self has returned, only that the structure of experience is becoming more stable. Stability is a prerequisite for wakefulness, but stability alone does not wake you. It simply lays groundwork. You may notice, if awareness brushes the surface here, that dreams feel closer to something recognizable. Not realistic, but familiar in shape, like scenes that almost make sense. Almost. This almost is intentional. If the dream became too coherent, awareness might anchor. If awareness anchored, the brain would have to decide whether to wake or suppress it. So the brain keeps coherence just below that threshold, enough to train continuity, not enough to invite consciousness. As this continues, emotional tone shifts again. Dreams earlier in the night often carried raw emotional charge. They processed tension. They discharged residue. Now, emotion becomes softer, less intense, more neutral. Not because emotion is gone, but because regulation has improved. The brain is no longer testing extremes. It is calibrating baseline, what feels normal, what level of alertness is sustainable, what emotional tone supports stable wakefulness. These questions are not asked. They are enacted through repetition. The body participates quietly. Heart rate variability changes. Breathing patterns become slightly more responsive. Muscle tone increases just enough to support posture later. None of this reaches awareness, and that is important. Awareness would interfere. Preparation works best when unnoticed. This is why when you wake naturally, it often feels smooth, not abrupt, because the brain has been preparing for hours. As the night progresses through this phase, the oscillation between simulation and depth continues, but with a different balance. Depth becomes shorter. Simulation becomes more frequent, not vivid, not demanding, just more present. The brain is rehearsing transitions, from stillness to motion, from isolation to engagement. These rehearsals are not literal. They do not involve getting out of bed or interacting with the world. They involve capacity. Can attention sustain longer spans? Can memory hold sequences again? Can the system tolerate gradual increase in input? Each rehearsal answers a small part of these questions, and with each answer, readiness increases. Still, there is no urgency. The brain does not rush this process. Rushing would create stress. Stress would undo the restoration already achieved. So everything happens slowly, gently, in cycles. Dreams may come and go. Awareness may flicker briefly, then disappear again. There is no direction yet, just adjustment. At some point during this phase, the brain begins to rebuild the sense of time, not measured time, relational time, the idea that things happen in order, that something can come next. This is subtle. It does not feel like anticipation. It feels like continuity becoming possible again. Moments start to link, not strongly, but enough that if awareness were to appear, it could follow something. Earlier in the night, following was impossible. Now, it is merely unnecessary. This distinction matters. Wakefulness requires not just awareness, but the ability to remain aware across moments. The brain is reconstructing that ability, piece by piece. As this reconstruction continues, dreams may begin to leave traces, not full memories, just impressions, a color, a movement, a vague emotional tone upon waking. These traces are signs that memory encoding is coming back online, not fully, not reliably, but partially. The brain allows this because it has completed the most critical restorative work. It can afford some interference now, as long as it remains minimal. Throughout all of this, the body remains deeply at rest. Even as readiness increases, relaxation does not disappear. The two coexist. This is the paradox of late-night sleep. The system becomes more prepared without becoming more tense. This balance is delicate, and the brain maintains it carefully, because waking from this state will define how the day begins. Abrupt transition leads to grogginess. Smooth transition leads to clarity. The brain prefers smoothness, so it continues adjusting. Cycle after cycle, dream after dream, depth after depth, until eventually preparation outweighs restoration. Not enough to wake you, but enough that waking becomes possible. That possibility is still distant, but it is forming. In the next part, we will move closer to that threshold, to the moment when awareness begins to reassemble, not as a fragment, not as a probe, but as a stable center again, not yet awake, but no longer absent, the quiet re-entry of the self. Long before you ever open your eyes, awareness does not return all at once. It gathers, slowly, from scattered pieces that have been resting apart all night. There is no moment where the self suddenly reappears. Instead, there is a subtle sense of cohesion beginning to form. Not identity yet, not memory, not intention. Just the feeling that experience is starting to hold together again. Earlier, moments existed without needing to connect. Now, connection becomes possible, not required, but available. The brain has reached a stage where restoration no longer needs complete isolation. Enough balance has been achieved, enough repair completed. So the systems that support sustained awareness begin to reassemble, quietly in the background, without announcing themselves. The first thing to return is not thought. It is orientation, a vague sense of inside and outside, not clearly defined, but hinted. You may feel this as a faint awareness of the body again, not specific parts, just presence, weight, temperature, contact with the surface beneath you. These sensations do not demand attention. They simply exist again. The brain is testing whether it can reintroduce spatial awareness without triggering alertness. It does this carefully because spatial awareness is powerful. It pulls consciousness forward, so the brain keeps it diffuse. You are not in your body yet. The body is simply part of the field. At the same time, internal rhythms continue adjusting. Breathing becomes slightly more responsive, not faster, just more adaptable. Heart rate variability increases. The nervous system is preparing to handle change again, change without stress. As this happens, the architecture of awareness becomes more stable. Earlier in the night, awareness flickered and dissolved. Now, when it appears, it lingers longer, still not fully formed, still without narrative, but continuous enough to hold a few moments together. This continuity is new, and the brain monitors it closely. Does it remain calm? Does it escalate into thinking? Does it trigger evaluation? If continuity stays quiet, the brain allows it to persist. If it sharpens too much, the brain gently diffuses it again. This is why you may drift in and out at this stage, briefly present, then gone, then present again, not because sleep is unstable, but because the brain is calibrating how much awareness it can allow without undoing rest. Dreams during this phase may feel different as well. They may seem closer to waking thought, not logical, but structured. A dream might follow a path, move from one situation to another without collapsing. The dream self may feel slightly more like you. Not fully you, but familiar. This familiarity is a sign that identity networks are coming back online. Carefully, gradually. Identity is heavy. It carries responsibility, memory, expectation. The brain does not reintroduce it lightly, so instead it brings back fragments, preferences, tendencies, habitual responses. Not stories about who you are, but the shape of you. This shape helps the brain predict how waking will unfold. It helps align internal systems with expected demands. And all of this happens without asking you, without needing permission. As awareness stabilizes further, the sense of time begins to return, but only faintly. Not clock time, not morning or night, just duration. A feeling that something has lasted and might continue. This is enough. Time does not need precision yet, only flow. Flow allows continuity. Continuity allows planning later. For now, it simply allows presence. You may notice that sounds from the environment feel closer, not louder, just more defined. The brain is widening its sensory window, not fully opening it, just checking. Are these sounds predictable? Are they stable? If nothing sharp intrudes, the brain continues. Vision remains mostly offline. Darkness is preferred. Light would force a decision, so the brain delays that. It keeps the eyes closed, keeps the world abstract. As the sense of presence grows stronger, intention begins to flicker. Not intention to act, intention to orient. A faint sense of being here rather than just happening. This is subtle. So subtle that it does not feel like effort. It feels like gathering weight, as if something that was spread out all night is slowly settling back into a center. This center is not the ego, not yet. It is a coordination point, a place where sensations, memory, and orientation can meet. Once this coordination point stabilizes, awareness can support more complex functions. But the brain is in no hurry. Complexity can wait. Stability cannot be rushed. So the brain allows this state to linger, longer than earlier transitions, because this stage determines how the day will feel. If awareness returns too sharply, the body will feel heavy. If it returns too slowly, grogginess will dominate. The brain seeks balance, a state where readiness increases while calm remains. As this balance improves, micro-memories may begin to form, not full recall, just brief impressions, a sense of having dreamed, a tone carried over, a vague emotional residue. These are signs that memory encoding is waking up, cautiously. The brain allows this because the cost of minor interference is now low. The major restorative work is done. From here on, preparation takes priority. But preparation does not mean awakening. It means alignment. Aligning internal state with an external world that will soon matter again. The body remains still. The mind remains quiet. But the system as a whole is becoming coherent again. This coherence is the foundation of waking consciousness. Without it, awareness would scatter. With it, awareness can return smoothly. You may feel now that sleep is lighter, not fragile, just less deep. This is correct. Depth has served its purpose. Now integration matters more. The brain continues cycling through shallow simulations and gentle rest. Each cycle slightly increases readiness, slightly strengthens the center, until eventually the system reaches a point where awareness no longer needs to be protected from the world, where it can return without cost. That point is still ahead, but it is approaching. In the next part, we will move even closer to that threshold, to the moment when the self begins to feel familiar again. when thoughts become possible, but not intrusive, when the brain allows you to exist once more, quietly, gently, before asking you to wake, not with an alarm, not with a command, but with a sense of arrival. The return of the self does not arrive with clarity, it arrives with weight, not physical weight, but presence, a sense that something has gathered enough density to be felt again. Until now, awareness existed as a field, diffuse, uncentered. Now that field begins to bend inward very slowly, as if gravity has returned. The brain is not rebuilding identity yet. Identity is complex. It carries memory, language, expectation. What returns first is something simpler, a point of continuity, a place where experience can land and remain. You may feel this as a faint sense of being someone again, not defined, not named, but located. Located not in the room, not in the body, but somewhere. This somewhere is enough. It gives awareness a center without giving it content. The brain prefers this. Content creates momentum. Momentum leads to waking. Center without content allows presence without effort. As this center stabilizes, sensations become slightly more distinct, still soft, still unimportant, but more available. The pressure of the surface beneath you, the position of your limbs, the quiet rhythm of breathing. None of these sensations demand response. They are simply acknowledged. This acknowledgement is automatic. The brain is testing whether awareness can coexist with sensation without escalating. So far, it can. That is a good sign. Thoughts may begin to appear now, not as sentences, not as ideas, as directions, a vague sense of orientation, up, down, inside, outside. These are not conscious thoughts. They are spatial markers. The brain is rebuilding its internal map. Earlier, space was irrelevant. Now, it becomes useful again, not to act, but to orient. Orientation is the foundation of wakefulness. Without it, experience floats. With it, experience can settle. The brain introduces orientation carefully. It does not restore full spatial awareness. That would pull attention outward too quickly. Instead, it offers partial mapping, enough to know there is a body, not enough to engage it. You may notice that your breathing feels closer now, not controlled, just nearer, as if the boundary between observing and breathing has thinned. This is intentional. Breath is a bridge. It links involuntary systems with awareness. The brain uses it as a gentle anchor, not to wake you, but to stabilize you. Heart rhythm follows, still slow, still calm, but more coordinated. The body is preparing to support sustained awareness again. At the same time, dreams become less immersive, not gone, but transparent. If imagery appears, it no longer pulls you fully inside. It feels flatter, less convincing. This is because the center of awareness is strengthening. A stronger center reduces the power of simulation. The brain notices this shift and adjusts. It allows simulations to fade. There is no need for them now. Their work is done. They have rebalanced internal patterns. They have rehearsed responses. They have softened what needed softening. Now integration takes priority. Integration requires quiet. So the brain clears space. You may notice longer stretches of nothing in particular, not emptiness, just absence of events. This is not boredom. Boredom requires expectation. Here, expectation is minimal. This is simply a resting plateau, a place where awareness exists without needing stimulation. The brain values this state. It is one of the most stable configurations between sleep and wakefulness. Too much stimulation would wake you. Too little would send you back into depth. This balance is precise. The brain maintains it by adjusting microsignals constantly. Temperature, hormones, neural thresholds, all without awareness, all in service of a smooth return. As the center of awareness stabilizes further, memory systems come back online more fully. Not recall, but continuity memory, the ability to remember what just happened. You may begin to notice that moments connect again, that you can remember hearing a sentence and the sentence before it. This connection is fragile. The brain monitors it carefully. If continuity begins to accelerate into thinking, the brain slows it. If continuity remains calm, the brain allows it to persist. This is why you may feel as though you are half awake, not because you are waking, because awareness is now possible. Possible does not mean required. The brain is still deciding when or if to move forward. External sounds may register more clearly, not louder, just more distinct. The brain is widening the sensory window again, but it keeps it filtered. Nothing sharp enters. Nothing unexpected. Predictability is key. If something unpredictable occurs, the brain would respond, but in its absence, the system continues calmly. The sense of time becomes slightly more structured, still not measured, but directional. A sense that something comes after this. Not morning yet, just continuation. This directionality is essential. It allows the brain to plan re-entry into wakefulness without triggering it prematurely. You may feel that sleep has become lighter, that you could wake if you needed to. This is true, but need has not been introduced, so the brain remains here. This stage often lasts longer than you realize because it is comfortable. There is no urgency, no effort, just presence with low demand. Many people experience this as their most restful sleep, even though it is technically lighter, because tension has already been released. Only alignment remains. As the night continues, this alignment becomes more refined. The center strengthens slightly. Awareness becomes clearer, but not sharper. Clarity without sharpness is ideal. Sharpness creates stress. Clarity allows readiness. The brain is approaching the final transition, not to waking, but to availability. The state where awareness is stable enough to receive the world again, but still protected, still buffered. That transition is delicate, and the brain waits for the right conditions. Light, sound, internal timing, all must align. Until then, it holds you here, in this quiet, centered state. Neither asleep nor awake, but ready. In the next part, we will move to the moment when the outside world begins to matter again, when sensory input gains priority, when the brain decides that awareness can safely turn outward, not yet opening the eyes, not yet moving, just listening to the world beyond the body for the first time since the night began. Before you wake, the world returns quietly, not as sound, not as light, as relevance. For most of the night, the outside world existed only as potential, filtered, distant, unimportant. The brain knew it was there, but it did not matter. Now that changes, not suddenly, not completely. The brain does not open the gates all at once. It tests. A sound passes through, not interpreted, just registered. A shift in air pressure touches the skin, not named, just felt. A faint change in light presses against closed eyelids, not seen, just acknowledged. These signals do not wake you. They do something subtler. They remind the brain that there is an outside, that the internal environment is no longer the only one that exists. This reminder is gentle. The brain does not want to shock the system. Shock creates confusion. Confusion wastes energy. So instead, relevance is introduced gradually. The brain asks, is the outside stable? Is it predictable? Is it safe to begin monitoring again? If the answers remain yes, the sensory window widens, still filtered, still buffered, but open enough for patterns to be detected, not events. Patterns, a consistent hum, a familiar silence. A rhythm of distant movement. These patterns reassure the brain. They signal continuity. Continuity means there is no need for immediate action, which allows awareness to remain calm as it turns outward. You may feel this as a subtle shift in attention, not focus, orientation, as if something inside you is beginning to face a direction without moving. Your body remains still, your breath remains slow, but awareness gains a faint outward tilt. This is new. Earlier, awareness had no direction. Now it does. But the direction is broad, diffuse. It does not lock onto anything specific. That would wake you. Instead, it hovers, ready. This readiness is not tension. It is availability. The brain is preparing to receive information again without yet deciding what to do with it. At the same time, internal signals remain dominant. The brain does not abandon the body, it integrates. External relevance increases while internal stability is maintained. This balance is crucial. Too much external input would fracture the calm. Too little would delay waking too long. The brain calibrates continuously. Tiny adjustments you never feel. Neural thresholds shift, sensory filters modulate, attention networks synchronize. All of this happens below awareness. If awareness were to notice it, it would interfere. So it remains quiet, present, centered. You may notice that dreams are rare now, or if they appear, they feel thin, transparent, like images passing behind a screen. This is because the brain no longer needs internal simulation. The outside world is becoming available again. Simulation gives way to perception, not full perception, but readiness for it. This is why, when you wake later, dreams from this stage are often forgotten. They did not carry enough weight. They were transitional. As relevance shifts outward, the sense of time sharpens slightly. Still not clock time, but proximity. A feeling that something is approaching, not an event, just soon. Soon does not mean now. Soon means possible. This possibility is enough to prepare the system. Muscle tone increases just enough to support movement later. Not movement now, later. The body is being readied quietly. You may notice the body feeling more present again, not heavy. Not light, just there. Limbs feel like limbs again, not objects, not sensations, but parts of a whole. This coherence is important. Wakefulness requires a unified body map. The brain rebuilds it gradually. You're not aware of this reconstruction. You simply feel more whole. As the brain continues opening outward, sounds may become more recognizable, still distant, still unimportant, but no longer abstract. A sound can now be distinguished from silence, not interpreted, just classified. Classification is a sign that sensory systems are fully back online, but interpretation is still delayed. The brain does not want to think yet. Thinking creates momentum. Momentum leads to action. Action is not required yet, so the brain holds awareness in a listening state. Receiving without responding. This is one of the most delicate states of the night. Because it sits right at the edge of waking. But the edge is soft. There is no line to cross, only a slope. You may feel that if something were to happen, a loud sound, a sudden movement, you would wake. This is true. The system is ready. But readiness does not mean activation. The brain prefers to wait, to let waking occur naturally, without force, without alarm, because how you wake matters. It shapes the tone of the entire day, so the brain continues to listen to the room, to the building, to the world beyond the walls. It listens not for information, but for stability. If stability holds, it proceeds. If not, it adjusts, all without you. As this listening continues, awareness becomes clearer, not sharper, clearer. Clarity here does not mean alertness, it means coherence. The sense of I am here becomes more familiar, more like waking self, but still without urgency, still without goals, still without plans. This is the last quiet before the return of intention. Intention will come later. Thought will come later. For now, awareness simply exists in relation to the world, not inside it, not separate from it, just adjacent. This adjacency allows the brain to complete its preparation, to ensure that when you do wake, you will not be pulled abruptly from depth into demand, but guided gradually as the night thins into early morning. In the next part, we will move to the final transition. The moment when awareness no longer just listens, but begins to recognize, when perception turns into understanding, when the brain decides that the world is ready to be entered again, and when you slowly, gently become yourself once more. Recognition arrives before thought, before you remember who you are, before language returns, before the day has a shape. There is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when the brain stops merely receiving the world and begins to identify it, not naming, not analyzing, recognizing. This sound belongs here. This light means something. This pressure on the body is familiar. Recognition is different from perception. Perception is raw input. Recognition is relationship. It is the brain saying without words, I know this. That knowing changes everything. Because once the brain recognizes the world, it no longer needs to keep awareness protected from it. The filters loosen again, not all at once, just enough. External signals gain meaning, but not urgency. A sound is not just vibration anymore. It is part of an environment. Light behind the eyelids is not just brightness. It suggests direction. The body's position is no longer abstract. It is where you are. This is the first return of context. Context is heavier than sensation. It carries implication. If this is the room, then there is a day. If there is a day, then there may be demands. The brain knows this, which is why it introduces context slowly, carefully. It does not want demand to rush in all at once, so it allows recognition but delays responsibility. You may feel this as a gentle clarity, not alertness, just a sense that things are making sense again, without effort, without intention. The world feels present, but not pressing. This is a fragile balance, and the brain maintains it by controlling one crucial thing: memory. At this stage, memory returns selectively. Not full recall, not identity-level memory, just enough to support recognition. You may remember that this is your room, but not yet what you need to do. You may remember the feeling of being yourself, but not the details. This partial memory keeps waking soft. Too much memory too quickly would pull thought forward. Thought would bring planning. Planning would bring tension. So the brain meters memory carefully. It allows familiarity, but not obligation. As recognition deepens, the sense of self becomes clearer, not fully formed, but present. You are no longer just a center of awareness. You are someone again, still quiet, still undefined, but recognizable to yourself. This recognition does not come as a thought. It comes as a feeling of continuity. I am still here, not as reassurance, as fact. The brain uses this continuity to align systems. Identity networks synchronize with sensory input. Motor systems prepare for potential movement. Language systems begin to wake, but remain silent. All of this happens without inner dialogue. Dialogue comes later. For now, integration is enough. You may notice the urge to move beginning to form, not to act, just to adjust. A slight shift of position, a deeper breath, a subtle stretch. These impulses are signs that motor planning is coming back online. The brain is checking whether movement can occur without disrupting calm. If movement happens gently, without urgency, the brain allows it. If movement escalates, the brain may pull back slightly. It is still protecting the transition. As recognition stabilizes, emotional tone becomes clearer, not strong, not complex, but present. A baseline feeling emerges, neutral, calm, maybe slightly open. This baseline is important. It sets the emotional starting point of the day. The brain aims for neutrality. From neutrality, you can move in any direction. From stress, options narrow. So the brain prioritizes emotional balance here. Even if the coming day will be demanding, the brain wants to begin from calm. This is why waking slowly feels different from being woken abruptly. The difference is not time, it is sequence, recognition before obligation, presence before purpose. As the outside world becomes fully recognizable, awareness turns outward more clearly. You are no longer just listening, you are situated. The room has shape, the body has edges, sounds have sources, but still, there is no rush. The brain allows this state to linger if it can, because this is where integration completes. Internal state meets external reality, and they agree. This agreement is subtle, but when it happens, waking feels smooth, unforced, almost natural. The brain does one last check. Is there anything unresolved enough to interfere with waking? Any lingering tension that would pull attention inward? If so, it may delay waking slightly. If not, it proceeds. This is why some mornings you wake easily and others you don't. It is not willpower, it is timing. And timing is decided here, in this space of recognition without demand. As this phase completes, the final piece begins to return. Intention, not plans, not goals, just the capacity to direct attention, to choose. This capacity does not activate immediately. It waits, because once intention returns, sleep is no longer possible. So the brain holds intention in reserve. Everything else is now online. Awareness, memory, orientation, emotion, recognition. Only intention remains offline. And intention is the switch. In the next and final part, we will move into the moment when that switch is gently turned, not flipped, not forced, just engaged. The moment when the brain stops preparing and begins to act, when listening becomes responding, when presence becomes participation, when the night releases you, not because it is over, but because you are ready to leave it. Intention does not arrive as a decision, it arrives as availability. For a long time, the brain has kept intention at a distance, not because it was unnecessary, but because it was powerful. Intention organizes attention. Attention shapes reality, and once reality sharpens, sleep can no longer remain. So the brain waited. Now quietly, it allows intention back in. Not fully, not yet. Just enough. A subtle readiness to engage, not to act, but to choose. Choose where attention rests. Choose whether to move. Choose whether to remain still. This is the final threshold, and like all the others, it does not announce itself. You may feel it as a gentle tension, not stress, but potential, a sense that you could open your eyes, that you could move your hand, not because you must, because you can. This ability changes the quality of awareness immediately. Presence gains direction, not urgency, direction. The brain has decided that the world can be entered again, not all at once, not aggressively, but safely. This decision is not made in words, it is made through alignment. Internal systems are coherent, external signals are stable, emotional tone is balanced. Everything agrees, and when everything agrees, the brain no longer needs to keep you suspended between states. So it loosens its final hold. Awareness gathers into a familiar shape, not sharp, not loud, just you. Not the version of you that thinks or plans, but the one that exists before those things begin, the one that notices. At this moment, sleep releases without resistance. There is no snap, no jolt, just a gradual shift in emphasis. The outside world becomes primary. The inside recedes, not lost, just quieter. You may notice light more clearly now, even with eyes closed. Brightness has direction. It suggests space. You may notice sound with location, a hum over there, a silence here. Your body feels whole again, not heavy, not light, simply present. Breathing is yours, not observed, not automatic. Just happening with you rather than without you. This is waking, not the moment eyes open, but the moment participation becomes possible. Eyes opening is a detail. Movement is a detail. The real transition has already happened. The brain has handed control back, gently, without demanding anything in return. And this is why the first moments of waking can feel so quiet, so neutral, so open, because nothing has been added yet. The day has not spoken. Memory has not rushed in with tasks. Language has not taken over. For a brief interval, you exist without momentum. This interval is fragile. It does not last long. Soon, thoughts will appear, names, plans, responsibilities. Soon, the mind will resume its familiar rhythm. But right now, right here, there is still a trace of the night, not darkness, depth, a sense that something important happened, without needing to know what. The brain does not explain what it did. It does not summarize. It does not congratulate itself. It simply returns you, restored enough, aligned enough to continue. And the remarkable thing is this: you were never unconscious in the way you imagine. You were simply absent from the process. The brain worked without you, not against you, listening when no one was left to wake it, sorting what could be sorted, releasing what could be released, preparing you for a world that would return in its own time. Now, as awareness settles fully into place, the night completes its work, not with an ending, but with a handover. From depth to surface, from silence to sound, from presence without intention to intention ready to begin. And if you carry anything forward from these hours, it won't be a memory. It will be a feeling, a quiet steadiness, a sense that even when you are not watching, something inside you knows how to take care of itself. That knowledge does not fade when the day begins. It simply waits until the next time the world grows quiet enough for the brain to listen again.